What if everything you thought you knew about winning a war was wrong? What if every number, every logical calculation, every esteemed military expert on the planet was not just mistaken, but catastrophically, tragically wrong? In the spring of 1940, they were. The world was about to receive a lesson, written in fire and steel, that would forever change the very definition of warfare. This is not a story about a simple victory. It's the story of an impossible one. In May of 1940, confidence was a currency the allied nations of France and Great Britain held in abundance. France, in particular, was considered the bastion of European military might. On paper, their strength seemed undeniable, a fortress of logic and numbers. They possessed more tanks than the invading Germans, and many of their models, like the Char B-1 bis, were heavily armed and armored behemoths, individually superior to the German Panzer III and IV tanks. Their artillery was widely regarded as the best in the world, a legacy of their dominance in the First World War. And guarding their border was the Maginot Line, a chain of concrete fortifications so immense, so technologically advanced, that it was considered nothing short of impregnable. It wasn't just a wall. It was a psychological statement, a declaration that the horrors of trench warfare would never again scar French soil. This was to be a war fought on their terms. Watching all of this from the sidelines, embedded with the British Expeditionary Force, was Jack Riley, a fictional American war correspondent. Jack had a cynical streak, honed by years of reporting on political promises and economic downturns back home. He'd come to Europe to cover what everyone was calling the phony war, a strange, stagnant conflict of posturing and waiting. He, like most of the world, believed the narrative. He saw the columns of British soldiers, cheerful and professional. He saw the endless lines of French troops, secure in the knowledge that they were defending their homeland from behind an unbreakable shield. The logic was simple. The Allies would wait, let the German war machine exhaust itself against their defenses, and then, with their superior resources, they would slowly and methodically squeeze the life out of the enemy. It was a sound, rational, and completely sensible plan, and it was about to become utterly irrelevant. The German attack, when it came on May 10th, did not follow the script. Instead of throwing themselves against the might of the Maginot Line, a small, concentrated force of German armor did the unthinkable. They punched through the Ardennes forest, a hilly and densely wooded region that the French High Command had dismissed as impassable for tanks. It was a move of such breathtaking audacity that it seemed to defy military common sense. For Jack Riley, the first reports that trickled in were treated as battlefield rumors, the confused whispers of panicked soldiers. German tanks in the Ardennes? Impossible. But then the whispers became a roar. The impossible became a terrifying reality. Jack found himself swept up in a tide of chaos and disbelief. He wasn't reporting on a battle anymore. He was documenting a nervous breakdown on a national scale. He saw French generals, men of immense reputation, staring blankly at maps, unable to comprehend a situation that was changing not day by day, but hour by hour. Their entire command structure, a rigid, top-down system that demanded permission for every major move, was paralyzed. While they waited for orders, the German panzers were already miles behind their lines, severing communications, capturing supply depots, and creating a psychological vortex of fear. Jack's dispatches back to his paper in Chicago became increasingly frantic, his words struggling to convey the sheer speed of the collapse. "They are not supposed to be here," he wrote one night, huddled in a makeshift command post, as the sound of distant explosions rattled the cold windows. "They move like ghosts. We see them, we report them, and by the time our commanders have made a decision, the ghosts are gone, having already struck 10 miles deeper." This wasn't a battle of attrition. It was a revolution in the application of time itself. Within a matter of weeks, the nation that was supposed to have the most powerful army in Europe was brought to its knees. The British were hurled back to the sea at Dunkirk, and on the 22nd of June, 1940, just 42 days after the invasion began, France signed an armistice, a victory that should have taken years, if it was even possible, was over in less time than it takes for a season to change. The world was in shock. How did this happen? How could a smaller, theoretically weaker army dismantle a superior force with such brutal efficiency? The easy answer, the myth that would persist for decades, was technology. The world became obsessed with the image of the German Panzer tank and the Stuka dive bomber. But that wasn't the real story. The real secret to this impossible victory was far more profound and far more revolutionary. This is not a story about tanks. It's the story of a philosophy, a command culture so radical that it empowered every soldier to think like a general. It's the story of how the German military trained its men not just to follow orders with perfect discipline, but to break them with even greater discipline when the situation demanded it. They had discovered that in the chaos of modern warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't a bigger cannon or thicker armor. It is the ability to make a better decision, faster than your opponent. Their secret wasn't forged in the steel foundries of the Ruhr Valley, but was carefully cultivated in the mind of every leader, from the highest field marshal to the lowest-ranking corporal. This is the story of how they did it. To understand the lightning strike of 1940, we can't just look at the battlefields of France. We have to travel back 2 decades earlier to a nation on its knees, a place where the bitter ashes of total defeat became the fertile ground for the most radical military revolution of the modern age. The story of Germany's military effectiveness doesn't begin with a bang, but with the deafening silence of surrender and the stroke of a pen on a document designed to ensure Germany would never threaten the world again. The Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, the victorious Allies imposed terms that were not just punishing, they were designed to be surgically crippling. Germany was subjected to a national humiliation. Its proud army, once the terror of Europe, was to be dismantled. The terms were brutally specific. The army was to be slashed to a mere 100,000 men, a tiny internal security force. The powerful German general staff, the strategic brain of the military for over a century, was officially outlawed. An air force, tanks, heavy artillery, submarines, all the instruments of modern industrial warfare were strictly forbidden. Germany was placed in a military cage, its claws clipped, its teeth filed down. This was meant to be the end of German military power. For most nations, this would have been a death sentence, a permanent relegation to the sidelines of history. But here, in this moment of absolute constraint, we find a powerful lesson, one that resonates deeply within the American spirit of innovation, the story of the underdog forced to reinvent the game. It's the narrative of a garage startup going up against a corporate behemoth. Lacking the resources to compete on the same terms, it must rely on ingenuity, speed, and a fundamentally different way of thinking. The Germans couldn't build a bigger army, so they decided to build a better one. They couldn't outproduce their rivals in machines of war, so they chose to invest in the one resource they were allowed to cultivate, the human mind. They would forge the finest soldiers, and more importantly, the finest leaders the world had ever seen. The quiet architect of this transformation was a man named General Hans von Ziegt, a brilliant, stoic, and deeply analytical Prussian officer. Von Ziegt was appointed to lead the new, shrunken army, the Reichswehr. He looked at the 100,000-man limit, not as a restriction, but as an opportunity. This would not be an army in the traditional sense. It would be a laboratory, a school for leaders. He envisioned a force where every single man was handpicked for his potential, a gene pool of military excellence. His vision was to create not an army of 100,000 soldiers, but an army of 100,000 future leaders. The core principle behind this vision was simple in concept, but profound in its implications. Every soldier would be trained to flawlessly perform the duties of the next 2 higher ranks. Think about that for a moment. A private didn't just learn how to be a good private. He was expected to master the responsibilities of a corporal and a sergeant. A young lieutenant, fresh out of the academy, wasn't just trained to lead a platoon. He was rigorously tested and drilled in the decision-making processes of a company commander and a battalion staff officer. This wasn't a suggestion. It was the bedrock of their entire training system. The effect of this philosophy was transformative. It created an army with an unprecedented depth of leadership and resilience. If a squad leader was killed in action, his corporal was not just expected to step up. He had already been trained for months, or even years, to do exactly that. He understood the broader mission. He knew how to read a map, how to coordinate with adjacent units, how to call for support. The unit wouldn't just survive, it would continue to function at a high level. This stood in stark contrast to many other armies, where the loss of an officer could cause an entire unit to stall, leaderless and confused, waiting for new orders to trickle down the chain of command. But what von Sicht was building went beyond mere battlefield resilience. He was forging a new organizational culture, one founded on the principle of maximum investment in human capital. He understood a timeless truth of leadership that applies as much to a modern tech company as it does to an army. Your equipment will always become obsolete, but your investment in the quality, intelligence, and adaptability of your people will pay dividends forever. He initiated covert programs, sending his best officers to study abroad, secretly developing prototypes of forbidden weapons in foreign countries like the Soviet Union and Sweden. He encouraged a culture of relentless study, debate, and intellectual rigor. His officers were not just warriors, they were scholars of war, expected to understand economics, foreign policy, and history, all to better grasp the complex nature of conflict. He was building an elite force, a concentration of talent that could, when the time came, expand like a compressed spring. Each of the 100,000 men was intended to be the seed from which a new, larger army could rapidly grow, passing on this culture of excellence and deep training. They were the framework, the skeleton upon which the future Wehrmacht would be built. This meticulously crafted army of leaders, this corps of hyper-competent soldiers, was a weapon of immense potential. But to truly unleash it upon the world, it needed more than just superior training. It needed a philosophy of command, a doctrine that would empower these men to use their initiative to its fullest, devastating effect. It needed a system built not on rigid rules, but on radical trust. It needed a concept so powerful that it would give this new army its soul and its deadliest edge. It was called Auftragstaktik. Most armies in history, and nearly all organizations for that matter, are built on a simple foundation: obedience. A superior gives a command, and a subordinate carries it out to the letter. It's a system designed for control and predictability. But the German army, being forged in the crucible of the interwar years, decided to build their house on a far more radical and far more potent foundation. They built it on trust. They gave this philosophy a name that would become legendary in military circles: Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. And it was this idea, more than any tank or airplane, that became their sharpest weapon. On the surface, the concept sounds simple. Instead of giving a subordinate a highly detailed list of instructions on how to accomplish a task, a German commander would define the mission's objective, explain the intent behind it, the why, and then grant the subordinate near total freedom to figure out the how. A typical Allied order might sound something like this: Lieutenant, you will advance your platoon to Hill 203, proceeding along this specific route, at this specific time, and establish a defensive line in this precise formation. It is a script to be followed. A German order, an Auftrag, would sound more like this: Lieutenant, the enemy is attempting to flank us from the east. I need to secure our northern flank and keep pressure on their advance. Your mission is to seize Hill 203 and hold it. The rest of the company will be supporting from the south. How you take that hill is up to you. The difference is monumental. One is a set of instructions, the other is a grant of responsibility. One treats a junior officer like a pawn on a chessboard, to be moved by a master hand. The other treats him as an intelligent, creative partner in the art of war, a co-creator of victory. This philosophy assumes that the man on the spot, the one who can see the terrain with his own eyes and hear the enemy's fire with his own ears, is in a better position to make tactical decisions than a general sitting in a command post miles away, looking at a map that might already be hours out of date. It was a system designed to thrive in the one condition that defines all combat: chaos. But we must not mistake this freedom for a lack of discipline. This was not about letting every officer run wild. The freedom was bounded by the commander's intent. A subordinate could deviate from the plan, even break a direct order, but only if their actions served the ultimate goal of the mission. And this is where we find the immense psychological weight of Auftragstaktik. It was a terrible and exhilarating burden. A young lieutenant was not just empowered to make decisions. He was obligated to, inaction, or passively waiting for new orders when the situation had clearly changed, was considered a greater sin than making a well-intentioned mistake. Imagine the pressure. You are a 22-year-old panzer platoon leader. Your orders are to hold position at a crossroads and await the infantry. But through your binoculars, you spot a fleeting opportunity, a column of enemy fuel trucks, lightly guarded, moving down a parallel road. Your commander's intent, as he explained it, was to disrupt the enemy's advance and sow confusion. The last direct order you received was to wait, but the opportunity is right there. A chance to cripple the enemy's mobility and achieve your commander's intent in a spectacular fashion. But it's a gamble. If you move, you leave your designated position. If you fail, you will have disobeyed a direct order. The radio is silent. The decision is yours alone. In the Allied armies, the safe, career-preserving choice would be to wait, to obey. But in the German system, the pressure was to act, to take the disciplined initiative. This culture produced leaders who were aggressive, opportunistic, and comfortable with uncertainty, because they had been trained from day one that calculated risk-taking was not just allowed, but expected. This was the polar opposite of the French and British command culture. The French system, in particular, was a highly centralized, methodical, and rigid structure. It was often referred to as a command-by-directive system. Every action was meticulously planned from the top, and initiative from junior officers was often discouraged. Viewed as a disruption to the master plan, it was a system that functioned well in peacetime, but in the whirlwind of a real battle, it became a fatal liability. While German panzer commanders were making split-second decisions to exploit a weakness, their French counterparts were often required to halt, report up the chain of command, and wait for new instructions to be passed back down. This delay, this decision-action cycle, was where the battle was truly lost. The Germans weren't just fighting the French army, they were fighting the French bureaucracy, and they were always faster. This radical trust wasn't born of blind faith. It was the logical capstone of the training system Hans von Sicht had created. Superiors could trust their subordinates to make brilliant decisions because they knew every one of them had been trained to think like a commander 2 levels their senior. They had wargamed dozens of scenarios just like the one at the crossroads. They had been tested, broken down, and rebuilt to be resilient, independent thinkers. Trust was simply the act of unleashing the potential that the training had already built. Auftragstaktik was the software, and the hyper-trained officer corps was the advanced hardware designed to run it. Together, they created a military machine that was more than a collection of units. It was a living organism, a network of intelligent nodes, each capable of adapting, reacting, and seizing opportunities at a speed that left its more rigid adversaries looking like they were standing still. There is an old saying in the military, a piece of timeless wisdom passed down through generations of soldiers. Generals get the glory, but sergeants win the wars. No army in modern history embodied this truth more completely or more deliberately than the German Wehrmacht. While the world focused on their charismatic field marshals and visionary generals, the true engine of their terrifying effectiveness was hidden in plain sight. It was their corps of non-commissioned officers, the NCOs. These were the sergeants, the corporals, the men who formed the steel spine of the German army, and they had been forged into a secret weapon unlike any other. In most armies of the era, the NCO was a disciplinarian, a taskmaster. His job was to enforce orders, manage supplies, and ensure the soldiers kept their boots clean and their rifles oiled. He was the essential buffer between the officers who gave the orders and the enlisted men who carried them out. But in the German system, this role was radically expanded. A German NCO, an Unteroffizier, was not just a manager of men. He was a leader of warriors, a teacher of tactics, and the living embodiment of Auftragstaktik at the most granular level, the bloody reality of the 10-man squad. He was expected to be a master of his craft, a tactical expert who could not only execute the mission, but also understand the why behind it. This philosophy connects deeply with a core tenet of the American cultural identity, a profound respect for practical experience and what might be called blue-collar wisdom. We admire the master craftsman, the skilled foreman, the person who knows how to get the job done, because they have done it 1,000 times. The German army professionalized this ideal and turned it into a cornerstone of their strength. They treated their NCOs not as glorified privates, but as junior partners in the enterprise of combat. They were selected for their intelligence, leadership potential, and initiative, and then subjected to training that was often as rigorous as that of an officer candidate. This system granted them a level of authority and respect that was unheard of in other armies, where the chasm between the commissioned officer and the senior enlisted man was often vast and unbridgeable. The practical impact of this system on the battlefield was immense, creating a level of combat resilience that consistently baffled Allied observers. Remember the principle of training every man for the duties of 2 ranks above him? This applied with even greater force to the NCOs. Let's revisit our young lieutenant, leading his platoon. A sniper's bullet finds its mark, and he falls. In many units, this moment would be decisive. The platoon, now leaderless, would halt. Confusion would spread. The men would take cover, waiting, praying for a new officer to be sent forward or for new orders to arrive. The unit's momentum would be lost, its fighting power effectively neutralized. But in a German platoon, something different would happen. Before the lieutenant's body had even settled, his senior NCO, his Feldwebel or sergeant, would already be in motion. He wouldn't be waiting for instructions. He knew the mission. He had listened to the officer's orders, and more importantly, he had understood the commander's intent. He was already trained to think like that lieutenant, and even like the company commander. He would instantly take command, redeploy his machine guns to cover the sniper's position, designate a new point man, and continue the attack. The platoon wouldn't miss a beat. The leadership was decentralized, redundant, and woven into the very fabric of the unit. The German army was like a starfish. If you cut off a limb, another would be ready to take its place and continue moving forward. This created an army that was incredibly difficult to break. You couldn't simply decapitate a German unit by targeting its officers. To stop it, you had to destroy it, man by man, because leadership was everywhere. This stood in sharp contrast to the Allied model at the time, where NCOs were highly valued for their bravery and experience, but were rarely given the tactical autonomy of their German counterparts. The German system actively blurred the lines, creating a continuous spectrum of leadership that empowered action at the lowest possible level. If brilliant generals like Heinz Guderian or Erwin Rommel were the architects of Blitzkrieg, designing the radical new blueprints for warfare, then it was the thousands of anonymous, highly trained, and deeply trusted NCOs who were the master builders. They were the ones who translated the elegant theories of rapid, decisive action into the brutal, chaotic reality of combat. They were the ones making the split-second decisions, moving a machine gun nest, exploiting a momentary gap in the enemy line, deciding to bypass a strong point rather than assault it directly that, when multiplied by thousands across a 100-mile front, created the unstoppable torrent of the Blitzkrieg. They were the true engine of the war machine, operating with deadly efficiency in the smoke and noise, far from the maps and pins of the high command. For the Allied soldiers on the receiving end in 1940, the German panzer divisions were not just an army of men and machines. They were something far more terrifying. They were specters, ghosts. They seemed to defy the laws of physics and time, materializing out of forests where they shouldn't exist, moving at speeds that seemed utterly impossible. They were everywhere at once and nowhere to be found. A phantom force that didn't just break through defensive lines, but seemed to bypass reality itself. And no unit embodied this unnerving supernatural quality more than the 7th Panzer Division, and no commander personified its audacious spirit more than the man who led it, General Erwin Rommel. Rommel was the living, breathing incarnation of Auftragstaktik. He was a commander who led not from a map table in a quiet chateau miles behind the front, but from the turret of the lead tank. He operated on a simple, brutal principle known as Führen von vorn, lead from the front. This wasn't about theatrical bravery. It was a tactical necessity. By placing himself at the point of friction, at the very tip of the spear, he could see opportunities and threats in real time. He could feel the battle's pulse and make decisions with an immediacy that was simply unthinkable to his allied counterparts. While they were waiting for runners to deliver messages and for reports to be collated, Rommel was already acting, a dozen steps ahead. During the Battle of France, his 7th Panzer Division moved with such relentless speed that it frequently vanished from the maps of his own high command. He outran his supply lines, his communications, even his own air support. Frantic superiors would demand to know his location, only to be met with radio silence. For days on end, he would be a ghost to his own side, as well as the enemy. This is what earned his unit its legendary nickname, the Gespenster Division, the Ghost Division. On multiple occasions, Rommel received direct orders to halt his advance, to consolidate his gains, to wait for the slower-moving infantry to catch up. And on multiple occasions, he politely acknowledged the order and then ignored it. This wasn't insubordination. It was the highest expression of disciplined initiative. He knew his superior's ultimate intent was to break the back of the French army, and he understood that the most precious resource in this new kind of war was not fuel or ammunition, but momentum. To stop was to die. But this incredible velocity wasn't just the product of a single commander's iron will. It was enabled by a subtle but decisive technological advantage. In 1940, the French army had more tanks, and many were better armored and better armed. But they had a critical weakness. Most of their tanks lacked effective two-way radios. Communication between tanks was often done with signal flags, like tall ships in the age of sail, or required a commander to dismount and run from tank to tank. It was a slow, clumsy, and dangerous process. The Germans, by contrast, had treated the radio as a primary weapon system. Nearly every panzer was equipped with a two-way radio, connecting the platoon, the company, and the battalion into a single, integrated communications network. To put this in a context an American can instantly grasp, think of a modern football team. The German panzers operated like a top-tier offense. The commander in his tank was the quarterback, able to receive plays from the coach on the sideline, but also able to read the defense in real time and shout audibles at the line of scrimmage, coordinating with his entire team in a fraction of a second. The French, by comparison, were like a team where only the coach could talk, and the players on the field couldn't talk back or even communicate with each other. The result was a German armored force that could adapt, improvise, and execute complex maneuvers with a fluid grace, while the French were left struggling to react to a situation that had already changed. And this leads to the deepest layer of the Blitzkrieg philosophy. It was never just a physical strategy aimed at destroying enemy equipment. It was a psychological strategy aimed at destroying the enemy's mind. The true target was not the French tanks or guns, but the French commander's ability to think. This concept was later formalized by a brilliant American fighter pilot named John Boyd as the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Every commander, in any conflict, goes through this cycle. You observe the situation, you orient yourself to the new reality, you decide on a course of action, and you act. The Germans, with their combination of decentralized command and networked communications, could cycle through this loop far faster than the Allies. By the time a French general had observed that Rommel's tanks were crossing a river, oriented his staff to the new threat, and decided to move reserves to counter it, Rommel had already acted. His tanks were 10 miles past the river, attacking the general's own headquarters. The French decision, so carefully considered, was now utterly useless. They were perpetually one step behind, reacting to ghosts, making decisions based on information that was already ancient history. This constant, high-speed pressure induced a state of cognitive paralysis. It shattered the enemy's confidence, broke their cohesion, and fostered a creeping sense of helplessness. When you add the terrifying shriek of the Stuka dive bombers, specifically designed to induce panic, the picture is complete. Speed was the ultimate psychological weapon. It attacked the enemy's most vital center of gravity, their will to fight. This lethal combination, a radical command philosophy, empowered leaders who embodied it, technology that enabled it, and a deep understanding of psychological warfare, created a formula for victory that seemed, in the summer of 1940, to be absolutely invincible. But a formula designed for a perfect 42-day knockout blow is one thing. What happens when that same formula is applied to a long, grinding, bloody war of exhaustion against an enemy with limitless resources and an unbreakable will? What happens when the Ghost Division meets the Russian winter? For a fleeting, terrifying moment in history, the German military philosophy seemed infallible. A perfect equation for modern war, Auftragstaktik, combined with the speed of the panzer divisions, was a key that could seemingly unlock any defense. But a key is only useful if it fits the lock. The Lightning campaign in France was a perfectly suited lock, a geographically contained area, a rigid enemy command structure, and a clear political objective. But the world is far larger and more brutal than Western Europe. What happens when a perfect theory, a philosophy of operational elegance, collides with the ugly, grinding mathematics of a global war of attrition? The answer was found in the vast, frozen plains of the Eastern Front and in the humming factories of a sleeping giant across the Atlantic. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, was the ultimate test of the Blitzkrieg concept. Initially, the results were even more spectacular than in France. The tactical and operational brilliance of the Wehrmacht was on full display. Using the same principles of speed, encirclement, and decentralized command, they tore through the forward-deployed Soviet armies. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. In the opening months, the Germans captured millions of Soviet prisoners and destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft. By any traditional military metric, they were winning one of the most decisive victories in human history. The system was working flawlessly. The individual German soldier, the NCO, the junior officer, they were still, man for man, arguably the most effective fighting force on the planet. But the Soviet Union refused to play by the rules. It refused to break. Every time the Germans destroyed a Soviet army, another one seemed to rise from the depths of the vast Russian interior to take its place. The Germans were fighting a war of annihilation, Vernichtungskrieg, designed to shatter the enemy's army and will in a single, decisive blow. The Soviets responded with a war of attrition, a conflict where their greatest weapon was their seemingly infinite capacity to absorb loss. They traded space for time and blood for survival. The German philosophy, designed for a short surgical war, was now mired in a seemingly endless swamp. The speed of the panzers was bled away by vast distances, choked by autumn mud, and finally frozen solid by the merciless Russian winter. The Ghost Division could outrun an army, but it could not outrun a continent. And as the German war machine began to grind down in the east, a new, even more formidable variable entered the equation. Across the ocean, the United States, jolted into action by the attack on Pearl Harbor, was transforming itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. This was a new kind of war, a conflict that would be decided not just by tactical brilliance on the battlefield, but by production spreadsheets in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles. The industrial might of the United States was a force of nature unlike anything the world had ever seen. The numbers are so lopsided, they almost defy belief. In 1943 alone, the United States produced nearly 86,000 aircraft. Germany, at its peak, produced around 40,000. In tanks, the disparity was even more pronounced. For every one advanced Panther or Tiger tank Germany painstakingly built, the US was churning out multiple M4 Shermans. The Sherman was, on a one-to-one basis, often outmatched by its heavier German counterparts. But the Americans weren't fighting a one-to-one war. They could afford to lose 2, 3, or even 4 Shermans to destroy one Tiger, because there were always 10 more rolling off the assembly line. This presented the central, tragic paradox of the German war effort. Their commitment to quality, the very thing that made them so deadly, also became a strategic vulnerability. Their advanced tanks were engineering marvels, but they were also complex, expensive, and difficult to maintain. The American approach was one of mass-produced, reliable, good enough. This wasn't a contest between a master swordsmith and a factory worker. It was a contest between the swordsmith and the factory itself. And the factory was winning. The Allies, however, were not just relying on brute force. They were also fast learners. The painful, humiliating defeats suffered by the British and Americans in the early stages of the war, particularly against Rommel in North Africa, were invaluable, if costly, lessons. They observed the German system, studied its methods, and began to adapt. They improved their own communications, developed more flexible combined arms tactics, integrating air power, artillery, and armor, and began to foster a greater sense of initiative in their own junior leaders. They were slowly, painstakingly, closing the tactical gap. They realized that their overwhelming material advantage would be truly unstoppable only when it was guided by a more dynamic and flexible command philosophy. This sets the stage for the final, decisive confrontation of ideas. A German army, still tactically superb but exhausted, overstretched, and bled white by a multi-front war. An Allied force, led by the United States, now possessing an almost unimaginable material advantage and rapidly absorbing the very doctrinal lessons that had once made their enemy so formidable. This raises a fundamental and deeply debated question of warfare. Can a superior idea, a more effective philosophy of fighting, ultimately triumph against an enemy with nearly limitless resources? Or was the fate of Germany's brilliant but finite war machine sealed the moment the conflict became a global contest of production lines? The answer would be found on the beaches of Normandy and in the Ardennes forest, where a new American army was about to demonstrate what it had learned. The most expensive lessons in the world are bought with blood on the battlefield. And by 1944, the United States Army had paid its tuition in full. The early encounters in North Africa had been a harsh education, a brutal seminar taught by masters of the craft like Erwin Rommel. American soldiers and commanders, confident in their equipment and numbers, were often outmaneuvered, outthought, and outfought by an enemy who moved faster and made decisions quicker. But the American character is defined by a relentless capacity for adaptation. It is a nation of pragmatists, of innovators who are not too proud to learn, even from a bitter enemy. And across the force, from the highest levels of command down to the muddy foxholes, the US military was learning, adapting, and evolving into a profoundly different and more lethal fighting force. Nowhere was this evolution more apparent than in the persona of General George S. Patton, Jr. A flamboyant, controversial, and undeniably brilliant commander, Patton was, in many ways, an American echo of the German command philosophy. He was a firm believer in leading from the front, often racing ahead of his own columns in a jeep to get a personal feel for the battlefield. He was aggressive, relentlessly focused on maintaining momentum, and possessed an almost intuitive grasp of mobile warfare. While he may not have used the term Auftragstaktik, his command style was its spiritual cousin. He famously told his officers, "Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity." This was the essence of commander's intent. He gave his subordinates the objective and the freedom to achieve it, trusting in their training and innate American creativity to get the job done. Patton's Third Army, in its legendary breakout from the Normandy beachhead and subsequent race across France, was a masterclass in this style of warfare. It moved with a speed and audacity that rivaled the German panzers of 1940. Patton understood, as the Germans did, that speed creates paralysis in the enemy. He pushed his men and machines to their absolute limits, bypassing strong points, punching through weak spots, and constantly operating inside the enemy's decision cycle. He was, in effect, wielding the weapon of Blitzkrieg against its creators, but now it was backed by the seemingly limitless fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles of the American industrial machine. But this transformation was bigger than a single charismatic general. It was a systemic shift. The US Army began to formalize these lessons. They saw how the Germans combined their tanks, infantry, and air power into fluid, mutually supporting battle groups, or Kampfgruppen. In response, the Americans perfected their own version of combined arms, developing devastatingly effective coordination between their armored divisions, mechanized infantry, and the ever-present swarms of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers that acted as a form of on-call aerial artillery. American junior officers and NCOs, having survived the trial by fire of earlier campaigns, were now seasoned veterans, more confident, more willing to take the initiative, and empowered by a command culture that was slowly but surely shedding its peacetime rigidity. And here we arrive at the story's most profound and unexpected twist. After the war ended, the U.S. military did something remarkable. Instead of simply celebrating its victory, it engaged in a period of intense and humble self-reflection. They systematically studied the defeated German army, not out of morbid curiosity, but with the focused intent of a graduate student analyzing a master's thesis. They debriefed high-ranking German officers, translated their training manuals, and dissected their command philosophy. And they came to a startling conclusion. The core principles of Auftragstaktik, decentralized execution, commander's intent, disciplined initiative, and mutual trust represented a fundamentally superior way to command an army in the chaos of modern war. What happened next is the ultimate legacy of this entire story. The United States Army didn't just study these concepts, they adopted them. They integrated them so deeply into their own institutional DNA that today, the official command philosophy of the U.S. Army is a doctrine known as mission command. It is, in almost every important respect, a direct doctrinal descendant of the German Auftragstaktik. The very philosophy that made the Wehrmacht so lethally effective in 1940 now forms the bedrock of American military power in the 21st century. The ideas of the vanquished had been inherited by the victor. The conflict that began in 1939 was therefore resolved not just by the weight of American steel, but by a fusion of strengths. The Americans won because they successfully combined their overwhelming material advantage with a command philosophy that had been perfected by their enemy. They learned to match German tactical flexibility while retaining their own overwhelming strategic power. They became a force that was both a sledgehammer and a rapier. When the final German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, was launched, it was met not by a rigid, paralyzed command structure, but by an American army that could bend without breaking. Units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, cut off and surrounded, didn't need moment-to-moment instructions from headquarters to fight on. Their mission was clear: hold the town. The how was left to them, and their disciplined initiative and resilience became the stuff of legend. The German war machine had created a revolutionary approach to warfare, but in the end, their greatest and most enduring legacy was not the territory they conquered, but the lessons they taught their conquerors, lessons that would shape the most powerful military in the world for generations to come. The story of the German war machine in the Second World War is more than just a chapter in a history book. It is not a simple tale of good versus evil, nor is it a sterile analysis of tanks and tactics. It is a timeless and deeply human lesson about how organizations and the people within them succeed or fail in the face of chaos. It's a story that echoes today, not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, on the playing fields of professional sports, and in the daily challenges of leadership that we all face. We began this journey with a shocking historical paradox: how a smaller, less equipped army achieved a victory that, by all logic, should have been impossible. We discovered the answer wasn't found in the steel of their panzers, but in the strength of their philosophy. We traveled back to the humiliation of Versailles, where German military thinkers made a profound choice. Unable to compete on quantity, they would dedicate themselves to creating unparalleled quality, investing everything in their most precious resource, their people. They built an army not of 100,000 soldiers, but of 100,000 leaders, each man trained to think and act 2 ranks above his own. Upon this foundation of human capital, they built a revolutionary command culture called Auftragstaktik, a system based on radical trust. It empowered leaders at the lowest levels to make critical decisions, to seize fleeting opportunities, and to operate with a speed and flexibility that paralyzed their more rigid opponents. We saw how this philosophy was embodied by the hyper-competent NCO Corps, the true backbone of the army, and unleashed with devastating effect by audacious commanders like Erwin Rommel, whose Ghost Division used speed itself as a psychological weapon to shatter the enemy's will to fight. But we also saw the limits of this tactical excellence. In the vastness of Russia and against the industrial might of the United States, a brilliant philosophy of war was ultimately crushed by the brutal mathematics of attrition and production. Yet, in a final, ironic twist, we saw how the victor learned from the vanquished. The United States Army studied, absorbed, and adopted the core tenets of its former enemy's doctrine, reshaping it into the mission command philosophy that guides its forces to this day. So what is the enduring lesson for us? Living in a world defined by rapid change and unpredictable challenges, the principles that gave the Wehrmacht its edge 80 years ago are the very same principles that high-performing organizations strive for today. When a tech company in Palo Alto talks about creating small, autonomous, agile teams and empowering them to innovate without waiting for layers of managerial approval, they are practicing a form of Auftragstaktik. When a masterful football coach gives his quarterback the freedom to read the defense and change the play at the line of scrimmage, he is leveraging the power of commander's intent. The lesson is clear. In any competitive environment, the organization that can learn faster and make decisions quicker will win. The culture that trusts its people, trains them relentlessly, and empowers them to take disciplined initiative will always have a decisive advantage. And that brings us to the heart of the matter, and to you. This history is not a relic of the past. It's a mirror for our own lives and challenges. And that's why we want to turn the conversation over to this community. First, we want to hear your thoughts on a critical leadership dilemma. We've discussed disciplined initiative at length, but there's a fine line between that and dangerous insubordination. So here is our question for the comments. In your professional or personal life, where do you draw that line? When is it right to break the rules to achieve the mission? And when does it become reckless? We're fascinated to read your perspectives. Second, we want to challenge you to apply a small piece of this philosophy in your own life this week. Instead of giving a team member at work, or perhaps even a family member, a detailed list of instructions for a task, try giving them only your commander's intent. Clearly explain the goal, the why, and then give them the freedom to figure out the how. Let us know how it goes. Did you discover a better way of doing things? Were you surprised by the results? Share your experiences below. If you found this deep dive into the lessons of history valuable, please consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the bell for notifications. It allows us to continue making content like this. In our next video, we will explore the untold story of the American codebreakers who waged a secret war of intellect and intuition, and whose silent victories saved countless lives in the Pacific. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching.